In 1903, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans was digging through the ruins of the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete when he found something that stopped him cold. It was a small figurine, about 30 centimeters tall, made of painted faience. She was holding snakes in both hands, wearing an elaborate layered skirt, and her tight-fitting bodice was completely open at the front, her breasts fully exposed. Evans called her the Snake Goddess, and she was 3,500 years old. What nobody expected was that this ancient figurine would rewrite what historians thought they knew about the history of underwear. Because the question of what women wore before bras is not just a question about fabric. It is a story about power, pain, revolution, and one very stubborn corset that took 4 centuries to kill. The island of Crete in the Mediterranean, around 1600 BCE, the Minoan civilization was at its peak, and their approach to women's clothing was unlike anything that would follow in the Western world for thousands of years. Those snake goddess figurines from the Palace of Knossos weren't wearing their open bodices by accident. Minoan women wore tight-fitting garments that deliberately lifted and framed the breasts while leaving them completely uncovered. These weren't undergarments. This was outerwear. Walk around the palace, attend a ceremony, totally normal everyday clothing. The breasts weren't something to hide. They were symbols of fertility, divine power, and status. The tighter the bodice, the more prominent the display, the higher the rank. And this was not some obscure footnote. Wall paintings across Minoan palaces show groups of women dressed exactly the same way. It was the fashion standard of an entire civilization, which makes what happened next in history feel like a very long overcorrection. Because when we move to ancient Greece 1,000 years later, the entire philosophy flipped. Greek women wrapped bands of wool or linen across their chests, tied or pinned at the back. These garments went by different names depending on the period and the city-state. The apodesmos, the strophion, the mastodesmos, the mastodeton. They all basically translate to breastband, and they all did the same job: flatten, compress, contain. Homer's Iliad, one of the oldest works of Western literature, references the goddess Aphrodite removing a curiously embroidered girdle from her chest. That scene was written around 750 BCE, which means the breastband was already old enough by then to show up in mythology. And in Aristophanes' comedy Lysistrata, written around 411 BCE, a woman teases her husband by slowly removing her strophion as part of a sex strike against the Peloponnesian War. So these breastbands were not just practical, they were part of the entire cultural vocabulary of attraction, modesty, and political power. But the goal in Greece was completely different from what the Minoans had been doing. It was not about display, it was about containment. A bound chest was a respectable chest. Young women in Sparta actually wore breastbands during athletic training, but the emphasis was always on control, not presentation. The Minoan approach of lifting and framing was completely gone. In its place was a philosophy that would echo forward through Western history for the next 2,000 years. The female body was something that needed to be managed. Rome picked up where Greece left off, but with more variety and a lot more practical thinking. Roman women had several options depending on the occasion. The strophium was a bandeau-style linen garment that wrapped snugly around the chest, similar to what we would call a tube top today. For daily wear, there was the mamillare, a softer binding cloth that flattened the chest under a tunic, and for exercise, there was something closer to what we would recognize as a sports bra. One of the most famous pieces of evidence for this comes from the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily, a massive Roman estate from the early 4th century. The entire floor of one room is covered in a mosaic that shows women competing in athletic events, throwing the discus, lifting weights, playing ball games, and even receiving victory crowns. Every single one of them is wearing what looks remarkably like a modern bikini top and bottom. Historians call them the Bikini Girls, and the image is so striking that when it was first excavated in the early 20th century, some scholars refused to believe it was genuinely ancient. It was. These women were elite athletes, and their breast support was engineered for movement, not just modesty. The stitching and structure visible in the mosaic suggests a garment that was cut and sewn to fit, not just a strip of cloth wound around the chest. According to classicist Jan Radica, Roman women seem to have had multiple different breast garments for different purposes, but the surviving evidence is frustratingly incomplete. We know they existed. We can see them in art. We just cannot say with certainty what they looked like in 3 dimensions, because almost none of them survived. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the same instinct was playing out independently. Indian texts from roughly the same period describe women wearing similar garments. A Sanskrit play from the 4th century mentions the heroine wearing a breast cloth that she uses as a dramatic prop, much like the Strophian scene in Lysistrata. In Ming Dynasty, China, between 1368 and 1644, women achieved the fashionable look of a flattened chest by wearing a dudo, a diamond-shaped cloth garment that compressed the breasts and protected the stomach. The dudo was not about support. It was about achieving a specific aesthetic, one that valued a smooth, flat silhouette over any kind of curve. The point is, humans across multiple continents and multiple millennia independently arrived at the same conclusion: breasts, once they are doing things that involve gravity and movement, benefit from some kind of management. The specific approach varied wildly, depending on time and place, and what the local culture thought a woman's body should look like. But the instinct to do something was universal. Now, here is where things get genuinely weird. For centuries, historians assumed that the modern bra was essentially invented in the late 1800s, and that before that, medieval European women either went without support or wore rigid corsets. There was no in-between. Then, in the summer of 2008, construction workers renovating Lengberg Castle in the mountains of East Tyrol, Austria, broke through a wall and found a sealed vault that had been hidden for over 500 years. Inside, packed between the floors as insulation during a 15th century renovation ordered by an Austrian noble named Virgil von Graben, were more than 2,700 textile fragments, leather shoes, scraps of silk and wool, over 200 coins, 160 handmade playing cards, bone fragments, pottery shards, and 4 pieces of linen that made archaeologists at the University of Innsbruck do a double take. Because these fragments, preserved perfectly by the dry conditions inside the sealed vault, looked exactly like modern bras. Not breastbands, not wrappings, bras, with distinct, separately cut cups. The lead researcher, Beatrix Nutz, was skeptical herself at first. Nobody had ever found physical evidence of bras with distinct sewn cups from the medieval period. There were vague written references scattered through European literature. A 15th century chronicle from Thuringia by a man named Conrad Stolle mentions women's shirts that had bags in which they put their breasts. Stolle, clearly unimpressed, then concluded that these garments were, and this is a direct translation, all indecent. Other medieval sources mention breast bags or bands used to bind down oversized breasts, but nothing that suggested actual structured cups. And without physical evidence, most historians assumed those references were exaggerations or misunderstandings. Until Lengberg, fiber samples were sent to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich for carbon-14 dating. And to everyone's surprise, the results confirmed it. These linen bras were from the 15th century. One of them is practically a dead ringer for a 1950s longline bra, complete with 2 cups made from separate pieces of linen sewn together vertically, a band extending to the ribcage, eyelets for lacing, and decorative needle lace around the cups. Somebody, 500 years ago, sat down and crafted a piece of underwear that Victoria's Secret would recognize instantly. The discovery blew up the historical timeline. But it also raised a question. If medieval women had figured out the bra, why did the technology disappear? Why did the Western world spend the next 400 years strapping women into whalebone corsets instead? The answer has a name: Catherine de' Medici. When Catherine arrived in France from Italy in the mid-1500s as the wife of King Henry II, she brought with her a fashion that would dominate European women's clothing for the next 3.5 centuries, the corset, or as it was known at the time, the body. Catherine's version was a tight, elongated bodice worn beneath clothing, stiffened with layered fabric and glue, reinforced with a busk. A busk was a long, flat piece of whalebone or wood, carved into a knife shape and inserted into the front of the garment. Later versions used steel. The idea was to create a completely rigid torso, eliminate any visible curve at the waist, and push the bust upward into a shelf-like silhouette. Ladies of the French court considered this corset absolutely essential to a woman's attractiveness, and in Catherine's court, a 13-inch waist measurement was considered the fashion standard. Think about that for a second. 13 inches. That is roughly the circumference of a large cantaloupe. To achieve this, women laced their corsets so tightly that their floating ribs were compressed inward and their internal organs were physically displaced. Contemporary accounts describe mothers laying their daughters on the floor and placing a foot on their backs to gain enough leverage to break the laces while tightening the stays. This was considered good parenting. By the turn of the 17th century, corsets were everywhere. They were made from bones and linen, reinforced with reeds and whalebones, laced with hemp or linen thread. Queen Elizabeth I wore them. French courtesans wore them. Working women in the English countryside wore them. In England, a Swiss visitor observed in 1745 that even in rural villages, all go laced because loose stays indicated loose morals. Wearing a corset was not optional. It was a statement about your character. A woman with an unlaced waist was a woman who could not be trusted. In the 18th century, corsets got even more extreme. Some versions were made from a species of leather called bend, nearly 1/4 of an inch thick, more like shoe leather than clothing. Others incorporated steel rods that ran the full length of the torso. The shape shifted with the fashion. In one decade, the ideal was a conical torso with a flattened bust. In the next, the goal was an exaggerated curve with the bust pushed as high as possible. But the constant through all of it was rigidity. The female body, left to its own devices, was considered unacceptable. It had to be molded. The Victorian era took this obsession and cranked it to 11. Starting in the 1830s, the hourglass silhouette became the dominant ideal, and corsets were specifically engineered to make the waist look dramatically smaller than the hips. They were boned with whalebone, steel, or reed. The front was flat, the back was curved, and the practice of tight lacing became a culture unto itself. Women exchanged tips in magazines about how to achieve ever smaller measurements. Some slept in their corsets to train their waists down gradually. Children wore them starting as young as 3 or 4 years old. Pregnant women wore modified versions because being visibly pregnant in public was considered scandalous. There were even corsets designed for men, marketed to early 19th century dandies who wanted a trim silhouette. The health effects were real, and they were grim. Did women actually faint from wearing corsets? Yes, some did. Tight lacing restricted breathing, limited digestion, and over time could cause curvature of the ribs and spine. Internal organs were compressed and displaced. The liver, in extreme cases, could develop grooves from constant pressure against the lower ribs. Doctors wrote papers about corset liver. They documented cases of fractured ribs, collapsed lungs, and restricted blood flow to the lower body. But here is the part that historians are careful to point out. The extreme cases were real, but they were not universal. The majority of women wore their corsets at a moderate tension and lived perfectly normal, active lives. The myth that every Victorian woman was perpetually gasping for air is partly a product of dress reformers who exaggerated the dangers to make their arguments more persuasive, and partly a product of modern movies that love a good fainting scene. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. Corsets were uncomfortable. They were restrictive. They could absolutely cause harm when worn too tightly. But they were not the medieval torture devices that popular culture makes them out to be. Because by the 1870s, a rebellion was brewing. Women in the dress reform movement began calling for the abolition of the corset entirely. In Britain, The Rational Dress Society was founded in 1881 with the explicit goal of promoting clothing that did not deform the figure or impede the movements of the body. They published pamphlets. They organized lectures. They designed alternative garments that distributed weight from the shoulders instead of compressing the waist. And in the United States, in 1873, novelist Elizabeth Stuart Phelps Ward wrote words that sound like they could have come from a protest sign 100 years later. She told women to burn their corsets, to throw the cruel steels that had lorded it over your thorax and abdomens for so many years into a bonfire and never look back. She called it emancipation. She told them they would never need whalebones again. But corsets did not die easily. They had too much cultural momentum, too much moral weight, and too many manufacturers profiting from their continued dominance. The Edwardian era actually introduced a new version, the S-bend corset, designed by a doctor who believed it was healthier because it pushed the bust forward and the hips back instead of squeezing the waist. The result was a posture that looked like a woman was perpetually leaning forward, as if she were about to tip over. It was supposed to be the healthy alternative. It was not. It would take a Parisian seamstress who had fought on the barricades, a teenage socialite with 2 handkerchiefs, and one of the deadliest wars in human history to finally finish the corset off. If you have been watching this far, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I cover weird history like this every week, and there is always more strange stuff to dig into. The woman who fired the first real shot against the corset was born in Paris in 1845. Her name was Hermione Cadol, though her birth name was Eugénie Sardon. She was a corseteer by trade, a seamstress who made the very garments she would eventually render obsolete. But Cadol was not just a seamstress, she was a committed political activist. In 1871, during the Paris Commune, she fought alongside Louise Michel, one of the most famous anarchists in French history. The Commune was a radical workers' government that held Paris for 72 days before being crushed by the French army. Cadol joined the Union of Women for the Defense of Paris and Care of the Wounded, one of the earliest organized feminist groups in Europe. When the Commune fell and its supporters were hunted down, deported, and executed, Cadol managed to escape. She eventually left for Buenos Aires with her family, where she opened a shop selling made-to-measure lingerie. She was good at it. She built a fortune. Then, nearly 20 years later, she came back to Paris with a grudge against corsets and an idea that would outlast every government she had ever fought for. In 1889, the same year the Eiffel Tower debuted on the Paris skyline, Hermione Cadol presented her invention at the Universal Exposition. She had taken a traditional corset and done something beautifully simple. She cut it in half. The lower portion remained a corset for the waist, but the upper portion was something entirely new. It supported the breasts using 2 boned cups and shoulder straps instead of pushing them up from below with rigid boning. She called it the corselet gorge and gave it the commercial name le bien-être, which translates to the well-being. It was, for all practical purposes, the ancestor of every bra hanging in every closet in the world today. But here is the twist. It flopped. Women in the 1890s still wanted tiny waists, and the full corset was the only way to get them. Cadol's invention was ahead of its time by about 20 years. She kept selling it to a select clientele, though. Mata Hari was a customer. So was Coco Chanel. By 1905, Cadol was selling the upper half of her design separately under the name soutien gorge, which literally means throat support, but in Old French, gorge meant breast. That term is still the French word for bra today. And Cadol's lingerie house? It is still in business, still family-owned, still operating out of Paris. Meanwhile, in New York, other inventors were taking their own swings at the problem. In 1893, a woman named Marie Tuchek patented something she called a breast supporter. It had separate pockets for each breast, shoulder straps, and hook and eye closures. It even had a metal plate shaped to fit against the torso, covered in silk or canvas. It looked remarkably like a modern push-up bra. But Tuchek never successfully marketed it, and the patent faded into obscurity. Then came the woman who gets most of the credit, even though she was not technically the first, Mary Phelps Jacob was a 19-year-old socialite from one of New York's oldest colonial families. She was the kind of woman who got photographed as a child by Charles Dana Gibson, the illustrator who invented the Gibson Girl. She attended prep school at Rosemary Hall. She was presented to the King of England at a garden party. She was, by every measure, a product of old money American aristocracy. But she also hated corsets. In 1910, Jacob purchased a sheer evening gown for a debutante ball. She tried it on with a standard whalebone corset, which was still the only acceptable undergarment for a woman of her class, and immediately had a problem. The rigid whalebone poked out visibly through the plunging neckline and sheer fabric. She later described the corset as a box-like armor of whalebone and pink cordage. It looked terrible under the dress. So she did something that sounds almost too simple to be true. She called her maid and asked for 2 silk handkerchiefs and some pink ribbon. Together, they stitched and tied the materials into a lightweight garment that covered her breasts, separated them naturally, and was completely invisible under the gown. Her friends at the ball noticed immediately. They wanted one. Then a stranger heard about it through word of mouth and mailed her $1, asking for one. $1 was real money in 1910. Jacob realized she might have stumbled into a business. On the 3rd of November, 1914, the United States Patent Office issued her patent number 1115674A for the backless brassiere. She founded the fashion form Brassiere Company, opened a tiny 2-woman factory in Boston, and tried to sell them to department stores. It never really took off. Her second husband, a wealthy Bostonian named Harry Crosby, talked her into closing the business. She sold the patent to the Warner Brothers Corset Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for $1,500. That is roughly $29,000 today. Warner went on to earn more than $15 million from that same patent over the next 30 years. Jacob, who later changed her name to Caresse Crosby and became a famous literary publisher in Paris, once reflected on her invention with characteristic modesty. She said, "I can't say the brassiere will ever take as great a place in history as the steamboat, but I did invent it." The real death blow to the corset, though, came not from fashion but from war. In 1917, the United States War Industries Board sent out an official request asking American women to stop buying corsets. The reason had nothing to do with women's health or comfort. The military needed the metal. Whalebone and steel boning were strategic resources now, and every corset on a civilian torso was steel that could have gone into a warship. American women complied. The amount of metal freed up was staggering. An estimated 28,000 tons, enough to build 2 full battleships. The corset industry, which had dominated women's fashion for 4 centuries, never fully recovered. World War I did more than just remove the corset from American life. It shoved women into factories, uniforms, and physical labor for the first time on a massive scale. You cannot operate heavy machinery in a rigid whalebone cage. Women needed practical, comfortable undergarments that allowed them to move and breathe and work. The bra was not just a fashion evolution. It was a wartime necessity. The 1920s sealed the deal, though not in the way you might expect. Flappers did not want lift or cleavage. They wanted the opposite. The ideal silhouette of the Roaring Twenties was flat, boyish, and androgynous. Bras were redesigned to compress and flatten the chest rather than support it. The bandage-style flattener bra became the look of the decade. A company called Boyschform even marketed a bra specifically designed to make the bust disappear entirely. After 4 centuries of the corset pushing breasts up and out, fashion had swung to the complete opposite extreme. But the real innovation of that era came from a Russian immigrant named Ida Rosenthal, who noticed something that seems blindingly obvious in hindsight, but that nobody had bothered to address. A bra that fit one woman did not fit another woman of the same general size. Bodies were different. Breasts were different sizes and shapes. You could not just make one bandeau and expect it to work for everyone. With help from her husband William, Rosenthal founded Maidenform and created the first standardized cup sizes. grouping women by bust measurements and developing different bras for different body types and different stages of life. By the 1930s, the S.H. Camp & Company refined this further, introducing the letter-based cup sizing system, A through D, that is still the foundation of bra sizing worldwide today. The bra kept evolving through the mid-20th century. Underwire designs appeared in the 1930s, though they did not become popular until after World War II, when metal was once again available for civilian use. The bullet bra of the 1950s, with its aggressive conical shape, became the defining silhouette of the decade, largely thanks to Hollywood stars. And then the 1960s happened, and the bra became something else entirely. It became a political symbol. Feminists argued that the bra, just like the corset before it, was a tool of male expectation imposed on women's bodies. The phrase bra burning entered the language, even though the famous 1968 protest at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City did not actually involve any fire. Protesters threw bras, girdles, and high heels into a freedom trash can, but nobody lit a match. A reporter compared it to Vietnam War draft card burnings, and the myth stuck. From 2 silk handkerchiefs in a Manhattan bedroom to a global lingerie industry worth over $90 billion a year. From snake goddesses with bare breasts in Bronze Age Crete to medieval breast bags sealed inside Austrian castle walls for 500 years. From Catherine de Medici's 13-inch waist to Hermione Cadol, a former communard, slicing the corset in half beneath the brand new Eiffel Tower. The history of what women wore before the bra is not really a story about underwear. It is a story about what different societies decided women's bodies should look like, who got to make that decision, and what happened when women finally started making it for themselves. Every era had its own answer. Lift them, flatten them, bind them, free them, shape them into cones, stuff them into bags. Each generation was absolutely certain that their approach was the right one. Each generation was eventually replaced by the next. The Minoan snake goddess is still on display at the Heraklion Archaeological Museum on the island of Crete. She is 3,500 years old, standing about 30 centimeters tall, holding a serpent in each hand. Her tight-fitting bodice is wide open at the front, her breasts fully exposed to anyone who walks into the gallery. She was crafted in a civilization that saw nothing unusual about this. She has outlasted every corset, every breastband, every whalebone busk, and every 13-inch waist that came after her. And she still looks completely unbothered about it. If you found this fascinating, the video on screen right now goes even deeper into weird history you never learned in school. So click it.